comments.
And how are you doing, Mark?
Very well. How you doing? I like your new, is that a new setup down there that you looks like you got?
Yeah, this is our new virtual studio.
Very nice. Very nice.
All right, so I believe we are on Facebook now. Carol-Ann, can you confirm for me? Good?
Yes, we are. Hello, Facebook. Welcome. It's Whiskey Wednesday again.
Woohoo! So for those of you that are just joining us on Facebook, we are welcoming you to tonight's virtual event that is featuring Woodford Reserve. Really exciting. My name is Shannon, and I'm a part of New Hampshire Liquor and Wine Outlet's social team. Really special event for you tonight. It's part of our 90 Days Around the World promotion. So last night we took you to Vermont with Whistle Pig Distillery, and tonight we're going to be visiting Kentucky with Woodford Reserve. So I'm joined by two experts. We have Woodford Reserve's master distiller, Chris Morris, with us. Really exciting to have him join us. We also have Mark Roy from our spirits marketing team. So Chris is going to be leading us through a really great program tonight, and I'm here to share any questions with him. So throughout the event, please feel free, if you're joining us on the Zoom call, leave your comments and questions in the chat window. And then for Facebook, please leave any comments that you'd like for us to ask Chris. So Mark is here to ask any questions or answer any questions regarding inventory, as well as any and all things New Hampshire Liquor and Wine Outlets. So please send Chris and Mark your questions and we will go ahead and get started. So Chris, I'll pass it off to you. What can you tell us about Woodford Reserve?
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. It is really exciting to be here. I love Whiskey Wednesday because sometimes we have programs called Woodford Wednesday. It begins with a W, so it works out just great. But it's fun to be with you all tonight to talk about 4 of our products and a little bit about our history. If you were at Whistle Pig last week, you heard about a new brand, a new distillery, and we're just the opposite. Well, sort of. We're a relatively new brand. And our story goes back into the early 1990s when our parent company, Brown-Forman, in America, decided it was going to create a new bourbon whiskey because we had been founded in 1870 as a whiskey company in Kentucky on the brand you know as Old Forester, still make Old Forester. But we wanted to do something very different. And if you go back to those many years ago, this was quite a radical idea. We wanted to make a whiskey for a global consumer. A global consumer doesn't mean necessarily living around the world, but things had changed since our industry was born in the modern sense after the Civil War, when people like our founder, George Garvin Brown, or Jack Daniels, or R.B. Hayden, who created Old Granddad, and the list goes on, were making bourbon and Tennessee whiskeys for a local audience. They weren't shipping to New Hampshire. There was no national audience. There was no international audience. They were making their whiskeys for local consumers, and they were making the whiskeys that people knew and understood. And they had never heard of things like tequila or vodka. They'd never heard of them. So it was a very parochial, a very focused flavor approach. Now, many years later, as we begin this new process, this new concept called Woodford Reserve, we know the world, the consumers in New Hampshire are drinking wine from around the world, beers, craft beers, spirits from around the world, gin, vodka, flavored this, flavored that, single malt scotch. I mean, the list goes on. So we have a global palate. We are drinking flavors from around the world. So if you're going to launch a new bourbon in the 1990s, that time was not cool. Whiskey wasn't cool. It was a different time. And we were really going to take a chance and launch a bourbon. So we were trying to cover our proverbial bases with creating a new bourbon that had flavors of the world in it. Fruit notes, spice notes, grain notes, wood notes, sweet aromatic notes. And that led to the concept that I've named the 5 sources of flavor. So we see on the screen a beautiful picture of a Woodford Reserve bottle with because if you don't know, we're the bourbon of the Run for the Roses of the Kentucky Derby, which we're so proud of. But let's take a look at our distillery, which is in Woodford County. Now, that is the oldest distillery building in the United States, still being used as a distillery, built in 1838 by Oscar Pepper. And that was the name of the distillery, Old Oscar Pepper. And that was the whiskey he made, Oscar Pepper. And it's a beautiful facility. And it had been closed, opened, closed, open, and finally closed, presumably for 1959. And we purchased it in the early 1990s. It was a ruin. It was a wreck. So we have rebuilt it, and now it's a national landmark because of its significance in the story of our country. But that beautiful building has been making bourbon off and on since 1838. But the key thing here is it's in Woodford County, Kentucky. That's where we take our name. Nobody named Woodford in anything with our brand. I've never met, literally never met a person named Woodford. We're named after Woodford County, Kentucky. It's the end of the marketing story, Woodford County. So in that distillery, because it was empty, been stripped of its equipment, it was a brownfield site. We could put in the processes, the equipment that we needed to make this new to world bourbon happen, creating flavors that no one, in our opinion, had ever created before with a purpose. Again, they had the flavors of the world in it. Wine flavors, beer flavors, whiskey flavors, multiple flavors. So let's go to the next slide. And we're just going to walk in that white door. And here are our fermenters. Our fermenters, again, are old fashioned. It's, I think, one of the fun story bits about Woodford Reserve. To make this new bourbon, we went back in time. We wanted to put in the equipment that the founders of the bourbon industry would have used. They did not have stainless steel fermenters. And this is not a knock against stainless steel fermenters. They're awesome. But we put in old fashioned Cypress fermenters, open top, small. And here you see a fermenter being steamed before we're going to fill it with the mash for fermentation. The only way our ancestors could sterilize was to steam these wooden vessels. So that's part of our process, is old fashioned. So in this fermenter, we're going to add our recipe, which is bourbon, of course. We're going to talk about rye, malt, whiskeys over the course of our visit tonight, but our bourbon is the core of our business. It's 72% corn, 18% rye, 10% malted barley. It's a high rye recipe at 18%. There's where some spice comes from. At 72%, it's a bourbon, obviously, but it's not too sweet from grain. And then at 10% malted barley, we have a lot of nice malty, nutty notes in Woodford Reserve. And also by the fact that we use 10% malt, we use no artificial enzymes in our process. So we have enough natural enzymic action from 10% malt to convert the rye and the corn starch naturally for an old sugar. So our process is natural. So we're going to ferment with our unique strain of yeast. And this is becoming very rare. We have a unique strain of yeast. It's called Woodford Reserve 78B. It's used only at our distillery, and it's been bred to ferment slowly. So we will ferment a mash for 7 days, longest in the history of Kentucky bourbon. And we do that based on a lot of research we've done to create fruit esters. So if you're a wine drinker or a craft beer drinker who loves fruity beer, you like a brandy or a cognac, we have a tremendous amount of fruit character because we ferment for a very long period of time. Well, after fermentation, we have our distiller's beer, and we're going to move to the next slide, which shows one of our more striking features, our pot stills. Again, we changed the industry. We decided to bring pot stills back to Kentucky because the last pot still used in Kentucky was in 1916, before Prohibition, 1916. So we brought pot stills crafted specifically for us in Scotland. And look at that, a 3-pot set. We brought triple distillation to America. We're the first distillery in the history of our country to triple distill whiskey. like the Irish. Because if you know a good Irish whiskey, you know how fruity they are and how delicate they can be. So we wanted that process. And again, that's the beauty of creating a new distillery in the early 1990s. We could borrow from the world, from tequila, from cognac, from malt whiskeys, from Irish. We can look at the world and see where flavors come from. And that's what we did. So an absolutely unique distillation process, which brings our spice and nutty and fruity notes from our recipe and our fermentation forward. And then into the barrel we go. And our barrels go into the next picture, which is one of our real pride and joy, Warehouse C, an 1890s bourbon warehouse. We've got 19th, 20th, and we're building new warehouses right now, 21st century warehouses, all out of masonry construction. Nobody would do that today, but we are still making the old-fashioned maturation process, which helps give our whiskey a great depth of character, because these old stone walls and the modern masonry walls allow us to heat our warehouses in the winter in the heat cycling process that was perfected in 1874. Not by us. We can't take credit for it, but we're still using this old process. And by heat cycling in the winter, we ensure that Woodford Reserve matures all year round, simply intensifying all the flavors and the spirit, and certainly bringing to life the barrel influence. Now, we, through our parent company, Brown-Forman, have our own whiskey cooperage. We're the only distilling company in the industry that makes its own barrels. And that allows us, and I use the term luxury, the luxury of making our own barrels. And we created a barrel that was specifically unique to Woodford Reserve. The first whiskey barrel toasted like a wine barrel, toasted like a cognac cask, and then charred like a bourbon barrel out of American white oak. No one had ever done that before. And that gives Woodford Reserve its range of sweet aromatic characteristics. We enter the barrel at 110 proof, which is pretty darn low, and into warehouse we go for a long maturation. And of course, each of our products is a batched product. So we don't have a single barrel product. I believe in marrying our batching barrels from many different dates, from many different years, to build a consistent flavor profile. So that is a real brief history of the 5 sources of flavor. The history is pretty recent. The history is about creating flavors that no bourbon had ever done from the onset by design to attract the widest audiences possible. But also by having these 5 sources of flavor, we created a flavor profile that is really exceptional. And that is the most complex, balanced bourbon on the market. Now, you would expect me to say that, and I'm saying it, of course, but it's proven scientifically. It's proven organoleptically. In other words, we know there are 215 organic flavor compounds in Woodford Reserve, all created naturally through this 5 sources of flavor process. We also know that they're in balance. And this is a pretty picture of our flavor wheel. And this is just not a pretty picture. The 5 areas of flavor are in balance. And they're graphically presented as such. And that's sweet aromatics, which come from the barrel, and spice, which comes from the grain recipe, the rye, and some comes from the oak. And we have the fruit and floral notes, which come from our extra long fermentation with our unique strain of yeast. We have the wood notes that not only come from itself, ironically, from the grain recipe, and then we have the grain notes themselves. So the key to having a complex flavor is to present it in balance. So in other words, if you want a spicy bourbon or spicy drink, Woodford Reserve will be just spicy enough because the spice is in balance with the other 4 areas of flavor. If you don't like your whiskey too spicy, Woodford Reserve isn't too spicy because the spice is in balance with the other 4 areas of flavor. So balance across sweet aromatics, fruit, floral, spice, wood, and grain presentation has been the key to the success of this brand. and we launched in 1996. And to me, that's still new. It's still new. But when you compare it to the great micro distilleries around the country, it's become one of the old time brands. But this new concept of the 5 sources of flavor, presented in balance, has taken us to the number 5 position in the American bourbon rankings. Number 5 in approximately 25 years on the market. And we're talking great company, Jim Beam, Evan Williams, Maker's Mark, Bullet, and Woodford Reserve at the highest price point of that group and growing very nicely. Thanks to all of you all for supporting that. So we know our flavor concept has worked. Another thing we knew we needed to do was change the appearance or the perception of bourbon. Because prior to Woodford Reserve, bourbons were looking very countrified, very rural, very burlap, banjos, and bluegrass, I like to call it. They looked like their old Southern brands, which is fine. But we wanted to appeal to people like yourselves, or in California, or in Europe. We wanted to appeal to a larger audience. And we knew this new bourbon had to look sophisticated, urbane, contemporary. And now this bottle isn't so shocking, but when it came out in 1996, it shocked the world. It didn't look like your typical bourbon. Maybe a cognac, maybe a malt whiskey, a Japanese whiskey. What did it look like? It really drew people's attention to it. And that's important. We all drink with our eyes, of course, but if the whiskey in the bottle isn't good, you'll buy that bottle one time and you won't come back. And of course, you've been coming back. So I think we did everything right. We did everything right, but it took a long time for that to show up because we launched again in 1996, and it wasn't until 2006, 10 years later, that bourbon began to grow again, began to gain appreciation, and now this momentum we all know is terrific. And Woodford Reserve was part of that move. So the first number of years were tough. They were very tough, but we persevered, and now we're in a good shape and allowing us to introduce some new and other great tastes and flavors to all of us. And we'll talk about those in just a moment. But let's go ahead and taste Woodford Reserve Kentucky Straight Bourbon, our original product, the product that has made our name, and it's made it to number 5 in the sales list that we're so proud of. And again, the balance of flavor. This is the one expression from Woodford Reserve. I cannot tell you what you taste. I can't say, oh, you're going to notice this, you're going to taste this, you're going to feel that, because I don't know what your palate is. When the flavors are in balance, I don't know what your personal palate preferences are. I can tell you what I taste. I can tell you what I knows. It's up to you to agree or go, no, well, I'll taste something different, which is the beauty of Woodford Reserve again. It's so personal. This brand is personal to each individual. You will literally find in it what you want. And when you have 215 flavors to choose from, that's plenty for any of us. So let's go ahead and pick up our glass. And I don't know what type of glass. That was a good question we had earlier. I'm using Glencairn glasses. You could use a rocks glass, a shot glass, a wine glass. It doesn't matter. As long as it's preserved, that's going to make it just special. Now, all of our products that we're going to taste tonight are 90.4 proof. 90.4. So if you think the rye is spicier than bourbon, it's not because it's 103 proof, or the double oak is smoother and softer. It's not because it's 80 proof. They're all presented at the same proof level. So we'll tell you why they're different. It's not the proof. It's not the age. It's not the typical levers that a distiller pulls. We're going to pull something different, and that's going to be a flavor source, not presentation of the whiskey. So again, if you notice differences, it's not because of the proof or the age. They're all on the same level of presentation. Beautiful color, of course, 100% natural. Kentucky Straight Bourbon, as you all know, can have no color or additives in it in terms of post maturation. All we can add is water, which obviously we do to reduce to 90.4 proof. And because this is a dynamic, complex bourbon, it will change even on your own palate. You know, we're after 5 o'clock today. I've already had lunch. You've had lunch, or you may have had a cocktail. Or what did you have for breakfast? Or is there an aroma in the air? Are you next to a rose bush, or is there campfire smoke in the air? This whiskey will adapt and change to your senses and what your environment is. So again, it can be different by the hour, even by the moment, depending on what's going on. And I have to admit, it knows it's very different tonight than my drink yesterday. I am getting a tremendous amount of candied orange peel. Not your typical first nose for me. So I'm getting this wonderful citrus note, which Woodford Reserve has a lot of caramel. And then as you get into it, you begin to find the spice character, and even the lemon, orange, and lime peel character you're picking up, if you're me, also lends you to that sharpness, which can be sort of spicy, but of course it's not, it's fruit. So very different, very, very different. Now let's take a sip, and if this is your first sip of the evening, remember you're sipping 90 proof, so that first sip is just more of an adjustment of the palate. And then you get into the second and third sips, and you can start to taste and experience the finish and the feel of Woodford. So cheers, everyone. This is not my first sip, by the way. Just beautiful. And now I'm picking up a little thread of dark chocolate, a little honey, a little sorghum. So I've gone from sharpness of citrus, which was candied, to a sweetness. Just beautiful. And a nice warming finish. And we can go on tasting this all night long, but we can't. Not over the time we have allotted. So that's just a brief introduction to Woodford Reserve bourbon. And I know if you travel, when we have been traveling on American Airlines or Delta, or maybe all the way to Australia on Qantas, or to the Middle East on Qatar or Emirates Air, you can enjoy a glass of Woodford Reserve. We've become a real international traveler, which has been tremendous. And of course, we are the official bourbon of the Kentucky Derby and the Belmont Stakes and a host of other great international horse races. And there's a long story there. We'll have to talk about that on another visit because it's a long story, but just for fun. So we have any questions for
Yes, Chris, actually, you have a bunch of questions.
All
We'll start
right.
with you before we start the next segment. So Jessica asks, what are the benefits of twice barreling?
Okay, well, let's talk about that when we get to double oaked, okay? But we'll keep that in mind. That's a good double oaked question.
All right. We also have, let's see. From Daniel, does the steam heated warehouse make aging or maturing faster or more consistent, or both?
Well, that's a great question. Yes. Heat cycling is not an accelerated process because there are other aspects of maturation that cannot be accelerated. And I think most of the accelerated maturation concepts of the recent years have been proven to be false. So this is, again, an 1874 process, patented in 1874, that enhances maturation. It makes maturation deeper, heavier, richer. So we're not cutting time. We're still going 7, 8 years in the wood. It's making that time better spent. So it will deepen the exposure to wood. It gives us another 4 or 5 months of the active maturation process. And because the Scotch Whisky Research Institute proves that when you drop below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, maturation stops. Whether you're in Scotland, Ireland, Kentucky, Tennessee, maturation stops. and we never let our warehouse get below 60 degrees. And again, we heat all winter long to make sure maturation continues.
Awesome. We have Anthony who's asking, are the barrels rotated in the rack house?
No, we do not rotate barrels. Rotating barrels has a number of issues with it. Every time you move a barrel, because it's just wood on wood with an iron hoop on it, just rolling a barrel across the floor will potentially make it leak because the wood is moving. So you're going to start leaking. Plus, you have to have, depending on what your concept of rotating is, at least a third of your warehouse space empty to move barrels into it and then move barrels around. You just can't have full warehouses and move things because it's impossible. And right now there is no spare room in Kentucky. Distilleries are building warehouses. We've run out of room building new warehouses, I mentioned. And again, it's just an exorbitantly labor-intensive process. And if you're heat cycling, you don't need to. You're heating the entire building. So your first floor never gets cold, your top floor never gets cold, or vice versa. It's all evenly heated, and that just negates any need to rotate.
Great. Let me see if I have, there's a few more questions in regards to some of that double barrel. So we'll definitely
Okay.
get those when we get to that product, but let me just
Okay.
we covered, let's see, we've got a question about the higher end expressions. So David asks an interesting question about what the output is of production, like barrels and bottles, and he relates it to other distillers that are constantly stating that, you know, there's an allocation game.
Okay, well, that's really, David. We have never run out of Woodford Reserve. We have now retired executive. One of the great quotes I thought of the industry is, "We plan for success. We plan for success." So we have planned for success, and we have very aggressive, detailed analysis of the industry, of the marketplace, that we update every 6 months, and we update our production plans accordingly. It's reviewed from the CEO down. I'm part of that process, and we make what we think we will need. We have never run out of Woodford Reserve. So don't stop buying us if you think you're going to run us out. We got plenty up in New Hampshire. But so yes, we have constantly been expanding our production capacity. We have updated and modernized our bottling house multiple times. We have been adding, as I mentioned, new warehouses. We have purchased a new tract of land a few years ago, still in Woodford County, and have just completed our 4th warehouse there. So we continually to invest in production capacity so we can have plenty of Woodford Reserve. And of course, we have to make it today for, say, 7, 8 years from now. So again, you have to have a far-looking predictive process, and we go out 12 years. So we look 12 years into the future, even though our core product is 7, 8 years of age. So again, you're going on the high side to make sure you have enough.
I'm sure everyone is very happy to hear that. You're not running out anytime soon. All right, so let me allow you to continue with your tasting, and we can touch upon some of these other questions after.
Yes, great. So let's move to Woodford Reserve Rye next, which we introduced to the marketplace approximately 7 years ago. And Woodford Reserve Rye comes in the green label bottle of our Distiller's Select range, and we're going to taste malt as well. So any one of our members of the family that you see in that classic, well, historic flask-shaped Woodford bottle tells you what it's all about. It's about the grain recipe. So think about this: the bourbon, the rye, and the Kentucky straight malt use the same limestone water, the old Pepper Spring. Remember, Oscar Pepper built our distillery in 1838. The same limestone water, the same Woodford Reserve yeast, the same 7-day fermentation, the same distillation, the same Woodford Reserve barrel, the toasted and charred barrel, the same warehouses, Everything's the same except the grain recipe. So when you go, wow, the rye tastes different than the bourbon, there's one answer for that. The grain recipe is different. The malt tastes different. The grain recipe is different. Everything else is the same. So you have a common denominator, which is everything but the grain recipe. So it's a very easy answer. The Distiller Select range varies in flavor presentation because of the grain recipe. End of story. And again, all 90.4 proof. So you can really taste the house style of Woodford, which is the fruit notes. Now, we talked about the Woodford Reserve bourbon being balanced. Everything else is out of balance. Out of balance, of course, by design, by necessity. The rye whiskey is spicier than the bourbon because it's a rye whiskey. End of story. Now, this was 72% corn, 18% rye, 10% malted barley. Our rye is 53% rye, 33% corn, and 14% malted barley. Now the barley, the malt has been increased because the rye has increased in its ratio. Rye is harder to convert into fermentable sugar than corn. So if you're an all-natural product, you need more more malt in the recipe. But why corn? Well, this is an old recipe. This is a recipe that dates to 1881. A brand called Old Watermill, which Brown-Forman produced, discontinued in the early 1970s when rye whiskey was in its steep decline. So this is an 1881 recipe that we put into the Woodford Reserve flavor template. How do you get these flavors? So this does not taste like Old Watermill. It tastes like Woodford's expression of rye. It's still very fruity. It has a lot of sweet aromatic notes. You can taste the grain, certainly the wood notes, those nutty notes, but the rye spice is bigger. This is a very bourbon-like rye whiskey, as some people have called it. Now, our spices are not pungent. There are pungent rye whiskeys, and there are very few whiskeys like this. These are comfort spices. Chinese 5-spice, cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, bit of anisette, and some savory spice, mint, peppermint, and then again the fruit. And the fruit is mainly citrus, like I tasted in Woodford, but also some tree fruit, apples and pears. So it's a really soft, sweet, pre-prohibition style rye whiskey. This is the way rye whiskeys used to be made like, before all this modern technology and artificial enzymes came along. So this is a very authentic 19th century style with the new Woodford look to it. Beautiful, 90.4 again. And as you nose it, it's extremely soft. And I'm starting to get that little hint of mint, a little eucalyptus, but there's a nice little coffee bean note, maybe a little mocha note. Getting those brown notes in here again, those comfort notes. Like who doesn't like a nice warm cup of coffee in the morning? You get those kind of characteristics. And there's that bright greenness again. And even though it's spicy, it's calming, it's rich, very smooth and elegant. And again, 90.4 proof, like the bourbon. And you go side by side, the bourbon becomes a caramel chocolate bomb compared to the rye, which now you can see is noticeably brown spice, even though they share common flavors across the two. So the rye came out, as I mentioned, about 7 years ago, and it's not a big seller because we don't have that much of it. Now, I'm not saying we're running out of it. This is not going back to the previous question, but we can't make a lot of it. We have to focus on making bourbon, and that means we focus on making double oaked. So we don't only have so many days a year where we can make our other whiskeys. So rye whiskey is always a limited production, and it's here to stay. It's a nice selling rye whiskey. It's a very nice selling rye whiskey in terms of rye whiskey. It's one of the top 10, but again, it's still a relatively small number. But I hope if you haven't tried it, you'll give it a try because it is so approachable. And this is a rye whiskey that you can enjoy neat on the rocks, and it certainly will go into any cocktail you want. So again, it's very versatile. It can go straight all the way to you name the cocktail. The same, of course, with our bourbon. You can take her straight and all the way up. And I think that's a standard of a great whiskey. You got it made. It goes anywhere you want to go. And I just caught that rye note. And if you don't know what rye smells like, it smells like rye grass seed, which I'm very familiar with. Oh, it's just brilliant, just beautiful, pure rye. So does anyone have any question on the rye whiskey?
We do have a couple of questions. So Bob asks, does the mash bill grain recipe percentage change from batch to batch or year to year, or does it stay consistent?
It stays consistent. The batching is of the barrels themselves. Now, that's a great question because most people don't understand or realize this because the industry doesn't really talk about it. You know, you harvest grain one time a year. I mean, you're not out in the field harvesting rye 365 days. You know, there's a week or two of harvest, and that grain has to last a year, whether it's corn, rye, barley, oats, you name the grain. You harvest, and that grain lasts till the next harvest. And since grain is natural, as soon as it's harvested, it starts to change. Of course, it's drying. And if you're storing it even in ideal conditions, guess what? It continues to dry. And it changes. And its chemical composition changes. So when you're using the very first harvest of that previous year, the first grain of that previous year, and 12 months later, using the very last of that same grain, the whiskey you make, even though the recipe hasn't changed, none of the processes have changed, the flavor will start to change. It happens. It happens. We all think leftovers taste better the next day or so. This is sort of the opposite. That doesn't taste bad, but the grain is going to change across the course of the year. And again, so while recipes don't change and processes don't change, there are changes. And the weather changes as well. In the summer, when it's hot, all of our cooling capacity is diminished. So the stills and the fermenters are running different than they do in the dead of winter when we can really cool things better because we're using a chill tower and our water. You can chill water a lot better in the winter than you can in the summer. So again, even though we're not changing things, things are changing. So I just mentioned those two to emphasize that all across the year, we don't change anything, but things are changing. So if that makes sense, good for you, because sometimes it doesn't make sense for me, but that's what's happening. Things are always changing. And that's why batching is so important. So 7 or 8 years later, we're tasting barrels made in January, barrels made in September. We're tasting barrels and we're noticing the differences. Ooh, this batch is really spicy. This batch is really, and batch, I say lot number, that day's production. And how do you build the flavor profile consistently? Is I'll take 10 of those barrels and 5 of those barrels and 6 of those barrels. It's all the same whiskey, but it tastes different according to when it was made. So we're batching to make a consistent product at the end because you want every bottle of Woodford Reserve that you get in the store to taste the same as the last one. And that's how batching works. Batching allows us to take variations in flavor and bring it all together at the end. So that's very important. Good question.
Chris, I actually have a follow-up question to that variation in flavor. Someone on Facebook asks if the weather affects the taste of those grains.
Yes, and of course, there's another good point. The weather is different every year. There's sometimes, well, we've had severe droughts in Kentucky, and that puts stress on the crop. And therefore, the grain will have different characteristics versus a very wet, season or a cooler season, etc. So yes, the weather impacts the grain itself from year to year. So there's so many variables when you're making an all natural product. Think of what the vineyards are undergoing in the West Coast right now with the smoke. I mean, my gosh, that's, the wine made this year or next year will be different than the following year or the previous year because of the smoke. That's just these environmental conditions that we have no control over, but they have an impact on the product.
Great. Okay, so I've got one more that I'll ask before I'll have you continue on. So this one you kind of covered a little bit, but Adam is asking if you make rye at a specific time of the year, and if so, how often? He's just curious about timing of it. Is it something you can do all the time?
Yes, we'll have a production schedule that is adjusted every 6 months. And so there is some flexibility in that, but you'll have your logistics, your supply chain where you've ordered grains, etc. So flexibility is a bit tight. So we usually will make rye in both the spring and the fall. So 2 times a year. And that will give us some nice variation for the batching process. Because again, the smaller your volume, it is a bit handcuffed by how often you make it. The bourbon, we're literally making it almost every month of the year. And that again is so important for the batching process at the end. And bourbon is our priority. So and that's not to slight the rye, but you have to have little windows of production. You have to have the glass, which is decorated rye. You just don't slap the same label on the bottle. You have to have everything in place, just like this New Hampshire Liquor Commission has to order things way in advance for it to get there on time. So again, that supply chain will have ramifications throughout the year.
Great. All right, and before I have you move on to the next product, I am just gonna let our viewers know about a promotion that we're running. It's
Yes.
for the 90 days around the world. So we're gonna be offering all of our viewers the chance to win some really great prizes. The grand prize being the chance to build your own at-home bar with a $2,500 gift card from the New Hampshire Liquor and Wine outlets, as well as some one-on-one guidance from our team of experts. Just to be sure that you pick all the right products to stock your bar. Hint, hint, Woodford Reserve would be a really great product to add. So entering for a chance to win is super simple. You just need to head to the App Store on your Apple or Android device and download the Scavify app. That's SCAVIFY. And basically, you're going to earn points for every event that you join with us by entering a code word. And I know that some of our listeners have been listening for that code word for tonight. So tonight's code word is Kentucky. So the more points you earn, the bigger the prizes that you'll be entered to win. So definitely get onto the Scavify app. You can find all of the details for that promotion on 90daysaroundtheworld.com. Again, code word tonight is Kentucky. So Chris, feel free to continue on to your next product.
Now that sounds like a great prize. Okay, we're going to finish real quickly because I'm going to spend some time on Double Oaked with our most recent release. No, 2 years ago. I'm losing track of time. Our Kentucky Straight Malt Whiskey, which has the blue label on it. This is very special, everyone. This is not an American single malt, which is a genre trying to be perfected and addressed by the craft industry. This standard of identity has existed since 1935. Kentucky Straight Malt Whiskey. That means it must be at least 51% malt and produced like a bourbon or a rye whiskey with the distillation parameters and of course the use of a new charred oak barrel, and in our case made in Kentucky. This is the one and only Kentucky Straight Malt Whiskey on the market, the first unique whiskey So we're number one. Yay, we're number one in the category because we are the category. It's a wonderful whiskey, and it is 51% malted barley, 47% corn, and do the math, just a pinch of rye. So it does have some rye in it. So this is an exceptional whiskey, and it's out of balance. Like the rye, it's out of balance towards the grain character. And the grain character, of course, is malted barley. And what does malted barley taste like? A malted milkshake, a malted milk ball. This is all about cocoa and chocolate and vanilla and hazelnuts and pecans. It's incredible. If you really want to smell malt, like an unmalted whiskey from Scotland, and there are some of those that are so wonderful. This is it. It has a pinch of spice. It's Woodford Reserve, same yeast, so it has fruit character. So again, it's complex. It's complex like the rye is complex, but again, like the rye, it focuses on one of the 5 areas of flavor, whereas our bourbon is the balance of all 5. 90.4 proof, just a tremendous treat to enjoy. Now, this whiskey is based in history. Kentucky distillers did make malt whiskeys before Prohibition. Everybody's forgotten that. And the first malting house in the history of Kentucky was built in 1785 in Woodford County. It wasn't us, obviously, we didn't exist then, but I thought, what a great historical connection that the first malting house in Kentucky was in Woodford County. And the only malting house in Kentucky is also very close to us to this day. So again, some nice little historic connections, but it's a beautiful whiskey, extremely soft, delicately sweet, and it's a straight, new charred oak barrels. So you can make a Woodford Malt Manhattan, a Woodford Malt Old Fashioned, a Woodford Malt, you name your favorite cocktail, just like you can with the rye and just like you can with the bourbon. As all straight whiskeys, they're going to stand up extremely well in cocktails. And like the whole family, you can enjoy this simply neat. And this is not competing with the great Irish malts, the Japanese malts, the malts from Scotland, because you can't compete with something when you're unique. So I like to taste this in conjunction with the rest of the Woodford family because there's nothing really to compare it to. It's an absolutely unique whiskey. Again, 51 malt, 47 corn, 2 rye, just a fun, unique whiskey. And again, we're producing it very, very limited. It's a permanent member of the family, but there's never going to be a lot of it, which is fine because it plays a flavor role. It's part of our flavor story. So I know we rushed through the malt very quickly because I want to spend some time on the double oaked, but do we have any questions on the malt?
Yeah, I'll just handpick just a few. How does the malt compare to the chocolate malted rye expression? It sounds similar.
Oh, yeah. Well, the chocolate malted rye was malted rye. This is malted barley. And malted barley, I mean, basically is, again, that malted milk ball, the candy, like the Whopper. That's what it tastes like. So there's a little chocolate in it, but that maltose, that malt character is the predominant flavor. The chocolate malted rye was rye that was malted, germinated, obviously, dried, and then in the kiln heated to the point of where the rye sugars, which had been formed during the malting process, caramelized. And it's a bitter chocolate. It's a dark chocolate. And then, of course, softened with corn and the rest of our process. So they're very, very different whiskeys. The malted rye is dark, sharp. Now, you know what I mean when I say bitter, like you love a dark, dark chocolate, but it's still like, ooh, that's not really super sweet. And this is super sweet. So there's a big divergence in how that malty note is presented.
Great. So Brent is asking, can it be called bourbon with only 47% corn?
No, this is not bourbon. This is a malt whiskey, a Kentucky straight malt whiskey, okay? So not a bourbon. It is technically a malt whiskey. Standard of identity from 1935.
And it looks like we have a Facebook question. So this is related to the distillery in Kentucky right now. Are you guys offering tours currently?
With COVID, no. Now we do have our gift shop open, and we have our Woodford bar. Serves only one product, Woodford Reserve, of course. Our bar is open for people to come and have a nice drink, but the distillery itself is closed for tours because of the health concerns, and we want to keep the workforce safe, and we want to keep everybody else safe. But we have been very fortunate not to have closed production in the distillery, warehousing, or bottling, not one single day since the COVID lockdowns and quarantines began. So we've been very fortunate. So we don't, asking about, let's don't run out of Woodford, that's important. So we got to keep production going. So that's why the distillery has been put off limits for tours. But again, the visitor center, which is a nice place to visit, and the bar at the visitor center are open, but not the visit itself.
I can sense a Kentucky visit in my near future.
We're all looking forward to that day.
Okay, so yeah, if you want to move on to the double oak, that one has quite a few questions. So
Okay. So very quickly, double oaked is in a different bottle, and it says barrel finish select range, and it's the first and currently only member of this range. So we have this range, which is differing by grain recipe. That's the Distiller select range. And anything in this bottle will differ by maturation. So this is our bourbon finished in a second barrel, the double oaking process. So this is a finish. And if you're familiar with your favorite single malt Scotch, for example, finished in a port barrel or a sherry barrel or Madeira or whatever the case may be, this is the same concept. We did not invent finishing, obviously. But we take Woodford, and instead of putting it in a second barrel that someone had used before, and again, I love port finishes and sherry finishes, but because we have our own cooperage, I decided to finish Woodford in its own new finishing barrel. And no one had ever done that before. And this was launched in 2012. So we make a second barrel. So we have two unique barrels in double oaked. The original Woodford barrel, which was the first whiskey barrel, as I mentioned, to be toasted and charred. And I failed to mention, it's a 10-minute toast and a 25-second, that's a number 3 char. This is off the charts different. This is a 40-minute toast. 10-minute, 40 minutes. This is a 25-second char, 3 char. This is a 5-second char, a 1 char. It's a very different barrel. It's always new. We never reuse the double oak barrel. We take fully mature Woodford that we can enjoy just as we have. And instead of bottling that batch, it will be entered at 95 proof into the double oaked barrel. And it will finish for a year, up to a year. Some batches, just again, we talked about the variations across the year. Some might be 9 months, 10 months, 11 months, 12 months, but that's the max. And it's out of balance, absolutely out of balance. You can see the color difference is extreme. It doubles in color practically, and it's out of balance towards sweet aromatics. And here's the double oak flavor. Well, there's the bourbon, balance. Look at double oaked. It's out of balance. The sweet aromatics take over. Caramel, chocolate, butterscotch, maple syrup, all the sweet notes that a toasted oak barrel will give you just dominate. But it's Woodford. It still has spice, fruit, grain, and wood character, but it is all sweet aromatics in terms of the lead. And again, as you nose it, it's all there, that sweet butterscotch, caramel, the list goes on. But then as you get into it, the fruit's there, but fruits have been intensified, and it's become dates and figs and raisins, and the wood notes, again, are almonds and pecans. Again, it's almost like a dessert. 90.4 proof. Straight bourbon. Nothing added to it. Not one drop of flavor, one not drop of color. All we've added to this is water when it leaves the barrel. Oh, and it's just tremendous. And it's been a huge hit for us, thanks to you all. The International Wine and Spirits Register recognizes it. I think just Market Watch did as well. It's the #1 ultra premium bourbon in the world. #1. And we're just getting started with this product. There's going to be a lot more excitement coming from Woodford Reserve Double Oaked. And we're just now starting to trickle it around the world. It's been so well received. Just a beauty, just a lot of fun. So again, that's the barrel finish range. So that's the bourbon finished in a second barrel, which is a new barrel. And just a wonderful product. And I'm sure you'll enjoy it. We're finding, certainly here in the heart of bourbon country, this is the bourbon that people who don't like bourbon like. I don't drink bourbon. Oh, it's too big, it's too bold, or whatever the case may be. And they sample Double Oaked. It's like, oh my gosh, I found a whiskey I can enjoy. I found a bourbon I can enjoy. So even though it's very expensive, it's being called the introduction bourbon because it can really bring people into the category because it's just so easy to drink. And again, 90.4. So don't be fooled by it because it does seem like it's proofed at a lower rate. So that's Double Oaked. Any of those wonderful questions?
Yes. So we had one from, this is the one that we asked earlier about the benefits of the double or the twice barreling process. That was from Jessica.
Yes. So Jessica, research shows that most color develops most intensely in the first year. And then the first 3 years is when most flavor development. Now the flavor development will continue over the course of barrel exposure, but it really starts to plateau out. So the differences are subtle, but there's a lot of benefit from that length. So don't misinterpret that in 3 years. I'm saying 3 years is great, but that's where a lot of the fundamentals of the whiskey character are established. So taking fully mature Woodford, 7-8 years, and then putting in this new barrel that is designed so differently than your typical bourbon barrel for that extra year at an extremely low proof of 95 proof gives that giant first year shot in the arm of all these sweet notes. So that's where that second barreling comes into play. It just, and of course the color, as I mentioned, doubles. So it's an impactful process. It's a very expensive process. Anytime you add a barrel to anything, barrels are very expensive. And again, going back to the rotation of barrels, which we don't do, but you're adding more barrels to your inventory. It just compounds everything. But when you have a product like this, it's certainly worth doing all that extra effort. Oh, I'm losing your voice there.
Oh yeah, it looks like Shannon's on mute.
Oh, sorry,
Uh-oh.
guys.
But Chris, let me ask you, probably the
Yes.
most important question of the night. I take it you got my memo about wearing a blue vest tonight.
So mine's black, but it
Oh
looks
no,
great.
look blue from here. I thought we were twinning.
Oh gosh.
So actually what I was going to follow up with is probably a better question for Mark. We have a Facebook comment that's asking which of these products is available in our liquor and wine outlets, and if all, what locations can they find them in?
Absolutely. Great question. I'm happy to announce that all the products that Chris has gone through tonight are available in our stores. The Reserve Malt that he talked about is actually in test markets. So that's in our 36 test stores throughout the state. But the other three products, the Woodford Reserve, the Double Oaked, and the Rye, are available in all locations. Currently, the Woodford Reserve is on sale right now at $28.99. It's on our Outlet Price Busters program, so it's a great deal right now for the holidays. So
Yes.
go out and pick some of that up. But not only are these products available, we've done a lot of, as he talked about, batch blending. We've done some personal selection barrels. We've done some of the double oak single barrel as well that are still floating around out there in the stores, and those are an incredible opportunity. And I can't not take the chance to toot our own horn. I believe we were one of, if not the first people to buy a double oak single barrel down at the distillery. So Chris can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we were one or two when they first started that double oak single barrel program. So Woodford's been a great partner with us for a long time, and we have some great products to offer our consumers for the holidays.
That's right, Mark. You all were some pioneers, certainly were.
Tooting our own horns here. All right, so it looks like we're just about at time. What I did want to let everyone know is that because there are quite a few questions hanging out there, what we can do is collect all these questions and send them over to you, Chris and Bob, if you don't mind.
Yes.
We can provide answers for all of these questions on our Facebook page under this event for all of viewers that didn't get their exact question answered. I did want to remind everyone again what the code word for tonight's event was for that Scavify 90 Days Around the World promotion that we're running. Again, the code word for tonight's event is Kentucky. I also want to thank Chris of Woodford Reserve for joining us tonight. Thank you so much. This was such a great presentation. And now I'm really excited to get to Kentucky sometime soon. Come check out the distillery when it's reopened, obviously.
Yes, yes.
And I'd also like to thank Mark and Carol Ann for helping me out on answering questions and, you know, collecting all of everyone's feedback on Facebook. And for those of you that are still watching, if you enjoyed tonight's event, please be sure to pre-register on our 90daysaroundtheworld.com website for future events, so you can be entered to win exclusive prizes from all of our different guests, as well as rack up additional points for your 90 Days Around the World passport. So just wanted to give a preview into tomorrow night's event. We're going to be joined by Jane Bowie, the Director of Innovation for Maker's Mark. And Friday, we are going to be having David Phillips, who is the co-owner and president of the Michael David Winery. So we've got a really, really great lineup for you coming up this week and just moving forward with our program here. And again, please don't hesitate to ask any of your questions. If you have any more for Chris, we can hunt him down, we can find him, we can get all those questions answered for you. Again, Chris, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been really, really fun.
Well, thank you for having Woodford Reserve in the program. And again, thanks everyone for your great questions. And yeah, we'll get everything answered. And then and good luck to everybody coming in this holiday season. Good luck to all the stores and everybody finding the special gifts they want to find.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night.
See you later.